I can't believe you spent all that money, and now you think you can just walk away, she said with a smirk across a mahogany table in my living room on 47th Street in Chicago that cold Tuesday afternoon of January 17th. 2023, it was exactly 3:42 p.m., and every clock in the house seemed to echo the humiliation I felt as I stared at my credit cards lie in front of me, all blocked, each one blinking red in disbelief like little warnings of my supposed incompetence and foolishness. My hands trembled, just slightly from the chill in the air, but mostly from the sheer shock and disbelief of being accused of irresponsibility after 3 decades of scrimping, saving, investing, and giving everything I had to ensure not just my comfort, but the happiness and well-being of my family. I had watched my 2 kids grow from toddlers in puffy winter coats, playing hopscotch on the cracked sidewalks of Logan Square, to successful adults buying their first homes in Lakeview and Wicker Park. I had banked every extra dollar from my part-time consulting gigs at the old downtown law offices, amounting to exactly $21,763.84 to help pay for their college tuition. I had driven the same 1998 Honda Accord for 15 years. Because I refused to spend unnecessarily, I had gone without vacations to make sure birthdays and Christmases were filled with joy. I had made countless dinners for family gatherings, watching everyone laugh, while my own contributions went unmentioned. I remember the smell of Mom's old apple pie baking in the kitchen when I was tending the soft faded carpet in our basement where my sister and I spent hours building Lego cities, and the summer evenings listening to Sinatra on the old record player we had saved up for months. Those memories flashed like a slideshow as I sat there and heard her words piercing me like an ice shard, and I noticed my neighbors peeking through the blinds of Johnson's from 3B Holding, their phones as if to record the moment like some guilty reality TV show, and my cousin Carla, who had just dropped by for a cup of tea, froze mid-sip, looking between me and her mother with eyes wide open. The tension was thick enough to taste like the burnt coffee lingering from our mugs, the leather of the chairs pressing cold against my thighs as the heating kicked in at a late 68 degrees on the thermostat to fight the January chill. But nothing warmed the sting of betrayal. I had invested my entire life, and now in exactly 15 minutes she would deliver a verdict that would determine if all of that effort meant nothing or the tables would somehow turn. And I felt the first subtle shift in my chest, a strange mix of indignation and disbelief that maybe, just maybe, this confrontation would not end in shame. You have ever been in a position where all your effort was dismissed and you felt the walls closing in and the world watching you crumble right there at the table? Take a second to breathe and imagine it, because that is exactly where I was, and you are about to see what happened next. You want to watch closely and comment below, because the feeling of having every single card blocked and every expectation shattered is something almost everyone can relate to, and the story that unfolded in that living room that day on 47th Street in Chicago would leave me questioning trust, dignity, and family loyalty in ways I never imagined. Yet it would also be the moment when a seed of empowerment took root, right there among the cold leather chairs, a mahogany table, the block cards, and the witnesses staring silently, waiting for the inevitable fallout. The first seconds of humiliation had passed, and the clock ticked on 3:43 p.m. with a chill in the air and a feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. I grew up in a small town outside Milwaukee called Brookfield, and my childhood was nothing fancy, but full of little joys and hard lessons. My dad worked at the local Ford plant from 6:30 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and my mom ran a tiny sewing business out of our kitchen, which smelled of fabric and warm starch on Tuesdays and Fridays. I remember vividly my 10th birthday on June 14th, 1968, when my father handed me 3 crisp $20 bills and said use them wisely, while my mother had baked a chocolate cake with lumpy frosting. Because she had used all the leftover eggs from the week, I had invited 2 friends from school, and we played kickball in the driveway while the neighbors peeked over the picket fence laughing at our muddy sneakers. I learned early that life required effort, sacrifice, and a bit of humor to survive. My first job was delivering newspapers starting at 4:30 in the morning in the summer of 1975, earning 75 cents per route. I woke up to the smell of dew and asphalt and the screech of the old paperboy bicycle chain, but I also felt a pride that made my chest swell. Every day, I saved that money meticulously in a small tin box under my bed, which eventually grew to $75.20, enough for a used bike and a couple books. I also babysat my younger siblings regularly after school on Maple Avenue. I learned patience in the afternoons when the Summer sun beat down through the blinds, and my sister would cry endlessly until I sang silly songs or made her laugh with old jokes. My mother often reminded me that generosity was a currency more valuable than gold, and those words stuck with me through adulthood. Fast forward to 1982, when I moved to Chicago for college at DePaul University. I lived in a tiny studio on Fulton Avenue with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that clanged at all hours, but I thrived because I had learned to value every dime I earned from part-time work at a local diner I cooked. Scrambled eggs for 20 people at 6 in the morning while the smell of bacon wafted and my arms ached from lifting heavy trays. But the smile on the customers' faces made it worthwhile. It was around that time I met her, my future mother-in-law, a tall woman with sharp eyes who wore pearls and smelled faintly of Chanel No. 5. She had a presence that filled the room like the chandelier in my small studio apartment. I tried to impress her with my knowledge of finance and careful budgeting, showing her spreadsheets of savings and investments totaling $63,247 over the previous 5 years. She nodded politely, but I could sense a hint of judgment in her glance, and that feeling never quite left me over years. I continued making sacrifices that most people would never notice. I skipped expensive trips to help fund my kid's first car, a Honda Civic for my son in 2004. Exactly $12,457, and my daughter's Toyota Corolla in 2006 for $13,890. I spent nights wrapping Christmas gifts meticulously to make them look perfect, even if my hands ached, and sometimes I used old ribbons and leftover wrapping paper from previous years. I hosted countless family dinners on Saturday nights at the old dining table, where my mother-in-law would comment on the menu. As if she was a food critic for a national magazine, she never failed to critique the portion sizes and often made subtle remarks about my frugality or lack of style, but I smiled anyway because I had learned that dignity sometimes meant swallowing small humiliations while giving joy to others, and my patience built a reputation among neighbors like Mrs. Hargrove from across the street, who would stop by with apple pies or gossip about family affairs in her nasal voice. While secretly rooting for me, I also volunteered at the local community center on Sundays from 9 to 12, organizing bingo nights and charity drives. Remembering the smell of the old wooden floors and hearing the shuffle of cards and the laughter of elderly residents reminded me why generosity mattered. And by the time my kids reached their late teens, I had accumulated a modest portfolio of investments and savings totaling exactly $87,642.19, which I had disclosed openly to my spouse while she nodded approvingly. But her mother always looked on with skepticism, even when I detailed how I had paid off every mortgage and loan on time. I often recalled quiet nights on Milwaukee Avenue with my father showing me how to balance a checkbook and my mother teaching me the value of giving without expecting thanks. Those lessons were now a deep part of me. I would never have imagined that all those years of effort, meticulous planning, hundreds of dinners, and financial decisions would culminate in a single afternoon where my mother-in-law would openly question my responsibility right there in my living room on 47th Street, Chicago at 3:42 p.m. The betrayal I felt was intensified because my history of patience, sacrifice, and care should have earned respect. And yet there it was, that sense of dismissal and judgment. My neighbors had watched through blinds. The Johnsons whispered to each other with smartphones ready, while Carla, my cousin, sipped her tea frozen mid-sip. The room smelled faintly of brewed coffee and vanilla from the candles I had lit to create warmth and comfort, but all of it felt meaningless in that moment. So if you have ever spent years trying to do right by your family and felt that your efforts were invisible or dismissed, stay with me, because the next chapter will show exactly how subtle disrespect escalates into the kind of humiliation that will make your stomach churn and your heart race. And you will see why sometimes decades of patience and sacrifice are tested in the most unexpected ways. And you might even find yourself asking what you have done in my shoes. Stay with me and watch closely, because what happened next will make you question trust, family loyalty, and dignity in ways you never imagined. By the time my kids had moved into their first apartments, I had invested countless hours and dollars into securing their futures. My portfolio had grown to exactly $94,312.56 after reinvesting dividends from my cautious stock picks. I had spent 3 years negotiating with a landlord on 1322 North Halsted Street to get a fair lease for my daughter's first place. She was 23 in 2011. And I had driven 5 hours each way from our home in Logan Square to make sure she moved in safely, carrying Boxes with every imaginable household item, including the vintage Pyrex bowls my mother had given me in 1978, which still smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar from the last pie she baked. I had done the same for my son moving into a studio in Uptown for exactly $1,025 per month with a security deposit of $1,025 paid in full out of my savings, and I had also quietly paid for furniture totaling $2,436.22 that matched his modest taste, but gave the apartment warmth I had invested in extra lessons for. Them both music for my daughter piano classes at the old music shop on Belmont Avenue, costing $540 per semester, and tennis lessons for my son at Lincoln Park Tennis Club, $635 for 8 weeks of classes. I had always imagined that these efforts would not go unnoticed, not just because of my financial investment, but because of the emotional labor I poured into every decision. I had hoped that family gatherings would reflect gratitude. A simple thank you from my mother-in-law would have sufficed, but early signs of disrespect had begun surfacing subtly like tiny cracks in a well-painted wall. She would comment on how my choice of dinnerware looked cheap or how I probably overstretched in funding extracurricular activities. Even though every receipt was meticulously kept, she never acknowledged that I had taken extra shifts at the diner or spent weekends delivering newspapers to fund these lessons, or that I had spent an entire summer volunteering at the community center to ensure a safe environment for her friends and classmates. I brushed these comments off at first, saying to myself, it's harmless. She's just set in her ways. I told my spouse quietly in our bedroom at 9:17 p.m. one evening, after a long day at work, that I felt dismissed, yet my words were met with gentle nod and a "she means well," which did little to soothe the sting. I had also noticed that during family dinners, she would subtly take the side of any minor complaint my children had against me or my spouse, as if she were training us for some invisible scoreboard of approval. My frustration was compounded when I recalled my father's words from long ago while balancing our checkbooks in Milwaukee. Wilson, never let anyone diminish your worth. Your work is your shield and your legacy. And my mother reminded me in her soft voice over the scent of her homemade apple pie, generosity is invisible sometimes, but its value is never lost. I had followed those lessons faithfully, saving $1,352.14. Here another dollar. $2,467.88 there over the years to provide a safety net for my family. I remember the smell of worn leather from my old briefcase, carrying stacks of carefully balanced invoices for community fundraisers, and the faint sound of traffic on Fullerton Avenue late at night. When I returned home from extra shifts, I had sacrificed vacations every year starting in 2005 through 2017, foregoing trips to Miami, New Orleans, and even New York City to ensure that birthdays, graduations, and holidays were celebrated with meaning and warmth instead of excess spending. I had also paid out of pocket for countless repairs of my children's apartments, the leaky faucet in the kitchen at $124.87, the faulty heater replacement $356.42, and the broken washing machine $429.30, all without complaint and without expectation of recognition. My mother-in-law seemed oblivious to these details, or chose to ignore them. I would catch glimpses of her judgmental stare across the dining room at family gatherings as she sipped her Earl Grey tea and smirked slightly at some perceived flaw in my planning. And yet I continued quietly, because I believed that integrity mattered more than ego. Flashbacks to my teenage years on Maple Avenue would flood my mind sometimes when I was alone. The smell of rain on the asphalt, the squeak of my sneakers against wet concrete, and the sound of my father explaining patience and diligence seemed to echo through every adult choice I made. Each dollar invested, each hour spent, volunteering, each late night of wrapping gifts and meticulous care, all built a tower of effort and love that I had assumed would be recognized. I had bought my mother-in-law her 50th birthday gift in 2009, a first edition cookbook from a local Chicago shop on Lincoln Avenue for exactly $312.56. And yet she had never once expressed genuine appreciation. Instead, she had made a quiet remark about the unnecessary expense in front of my spouse and children. The subtle disrespect compounded by years of giving began to wear at me like water slowly eroding stone. I noticed early signs during casual visits when she would comment on how I probably mismanaged minor household finances or gently criticize how I chose to allocate funds for charity. I would smile and nod, saying, "Yes, you're right. Maybe I should reconsider," while internally feeling a knot of indignation tightening in my chest the first time I caught my daughter filming a quiet exchange on her phone during one of these minor confrontations. I realized that the world outside our immediate family was beginning to witness these tensions, and my heart sank. I had imagined gratitude and warmth, but instead found subtle judgment and small humiliations being recorded by the very witnesses I hope would someday testify to our closeness and mutual respect. So stay with me, because the next chapter will show exactly how these minor slights escalated into public humiliation that would make every penny of effort feel both precious and at risk. And you will see why patience and sacrifice are sometimes tested in the harshest and most unexpected ways, and the consequences of ignoring these early signs will become shockingly clear as we move forward into the escalation of humiliation in my living room on 47th Street in Chicago at exactly 3:42 p.m. It started innocently enough that Tuesday afternoon at 3:45 p.m., just 3 minutes after she had uttered the words, "I can't believe you spent all that money." The first jab landed like a pinprick when she leaned back in her chair on a mahogany dining room table and flicked her wrist toward my carefully arranged credit cards, each one blocked, and blinking red the fluorescent light above us caught the shine on the mahogany like a stage. "Spotlight highlighting my humiliation," she said with a smirk, crossing her sharp features. "I guess all those years of saving and budgeting didn't really pay off now, did it?" Her tone dripping with subtle venom like syrup slowly poured over ice. I froze for a moment, unsure whether to laugh nervously or defend myself. My hands hovered over the table, feeling the smooth plastic of my credit cards, the ones I had accumulated over decades with exact balances and detailed records, each card blocked exactly at 4/328.56. 7 p.m. in real time, according to the notifications. On my phone, I tried to respond calmly, saying, "I don't think that's fair. I've kept every record and accounted for every dollar." She crossed her arms and rolled her eyes, saying, "Fair isn't the issue here. It's about judgment." And that was when I noticed my son, who had just returned from his part-time job at Target in Lincoln Park, standing frozen by the door with his hands in his pockets. He looked between us confused, and my daughter clutching her smartphone, as if ready to capture the moment, her eyes wide like saucers reflecting the chandelier above the table. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside mingling with the soft of the ceiling fan and the tick of the old wall clock at exactly 3:47 p.m., which somehow amplified the silence and tension in the room. I took a slow breath and tried reasoning. "Mom, I invested 3 years negotiating that lease for you, $20,000 in repairs for the kids' apartments, plus thousands more in tuition and extra lessons. Why are we even talking about judgment now?" She tilted her head slightly and smiled faintly with that cruel precision only years of practice can produce, and said, "Because it's about perspective, dear, and perspective is everything." And in that moment, I realized she wasn't just criticizing my spending, she was invalidating decades of my sacrifices, my patience, and every tiny gesture care I had offered in silence. I could feel the familiar heat rising in my chest, a combination of indignation and disbelief in the smell of brewed coffee on the table seemed almost bitter against the tension in the room. I tried to redirect the conversation, hoping for a peaceful resolution. "Can we just sit and go through the accounts together? I'll show you every receipt and transaction since 2000. She waved her hand dismissively and said, "I don't need to see your receipts. I just see a man who thinks he can control everything with money." That was the first time I noticed Mrs. Hargrove from across the street peeking through. The blinds her phone pointed at the window, as if recording a scene from a soap opera. The faint click of her camera echoed softly in the background, and I caught a glimpse of Carla, my cousin, sipping her tea, frozen mid-sip, staring between my mother-in-law and me, her brow furrowed in concern. The first test of my dignity had arrived, and it was witnessed in real time by family and neighbors alike. My stomach twisted slightly at the idea that this confrontation was no longer private. Each word from her cut like a scalpel. My attempts at calm explanation ignored and even mocked, and I felt the familiar sting of invisibility that had been slowly creeping over the years resurfaced with vengeance. I tried once more. "All of these investments were for the family, for your children, for everyone in this room. Why are we reducing it to judgment?" She leaned in slightly and said with a tone so casual yet so precise, "Because it's what I've always seen you do: control, manipulate, and overspend." Her voice echoed like nails on a chalkboard, and I noticed a subtle smirk of the Johnsons from 3 beholding their phones, as if to capture each syllable. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of humiliation pressing down. I could feel the cold leather of the dining chairs against my thighs, and the faint draft from the slightly open window against the back of my neck, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that the knuckles whitened as I tried to maintain composure. I realized that these first moments of public humiliation were just beginning. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of brewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of her Chanel No. 5 seemed almost suffocating. I caught a glimpse of my daughter filming the exchange on her smartphone, while my son leaned back against the doorway, unsure whether to intervene or retreat, and the faint sound of traffic on 47th Street outside was drowned out by the palpable silence in the room, every second stretching painfully long as I realized that. No matter what I said, the perception of my actions was already being colored by her disdain and by the witnesses silently recording, and yet I refused to raise my voice, preferring dignity over emotion, but the first cracks of outrage began to show as my chest tightened and my jaw clenched, and a silent promise formed in my mind that I would not be reduced to shame despite the witnesses, despite her smirk, despite the blocked cards I would find. A way to reclaim my dignity and the respect that had been earned over decades stay with me, because the next chapter will escalate this humiliation to a level that will shock you. It will show just how cruel arrogance can be when left unchecked, and you will witness the moment when a line of tolerance is crossed and patience runs out. The air is about to become electric in my living room on 47th Street, Chicago, at exactly 3:50 p.m. By 3:53 p.m. the room had transformed into a pressure cooker of tension. My mother-in-law's smirk had widened slightly, and each blink of the red warning lights on my credit cards seemed to mock me personally. I could feel the cold oak of the table pressing into my palms, my legs stiff from gripping the leather chair, and my chest tight, as if someone had wrapped a steel band around it. She leaned forward, now her voice slicing through the room. "You think you can just manage everything and we'll all clap for you? Well, guess what, Wilson, you miscalculated." The word miscalculated hung in the air like smoke from a candle burning too close to the curtains. I tried to reason again, keeping my tone calm. "Please, we can review the accounts together. I'll show every single transaction since 2000, every single dollar." She waved me off with a flick of her hand and said, "I don't care about the transactions. I care about the attitude." And that's when I noticed the full extent of the witnesses. Mrs. Hargrove across the street had stepped onto her porch and was holding her phone higher, filming every movement. My cousin Carla had risen from the chair, her tea long forgotten in the cup, and was recording as well. My son had walked closer to the table, unsure whether to intervene, but frozen with concern. My daughter continued filming the whole exchange, capturing every smirk, every word, every sleight of hand. She kept whispering into the phone, "This is unreal." The air smelled of brewed coffee with a faint hint of vanilla from the candles I had lit, trying to create a welcoming atmosphere, but it was suffocating now with the intensity of the scene. I tried one more time. "I've sacrificed every vacation, every extra hour at work, every ounce of my energy to make sure my family is cared for. Why reduce it to judgment?" She laughed softly, but it was cold and precise. "Sacrifice doesn't matter when your choices are transparent to everyone around you and you look foolish." That word foolish echoed in my mind like a hammer striking a bell in a quiet chapel. I felt the flush rising in my neck, my knuckles pressing harder into the table, each bead of sweat forming along my temple from the stress of being publicly shamed. My mother-in-law began listing minor expenses I had made for the kids in exact figures: $2,436 for his furniture, $1,200 for extra lessons, $54 for art supplies. Each number delivered with disdain and precision, and each one reinforced her narrative that my generosity was overstepping invisible boundaries. I could see Carla's eyes widen as she whispered, "I can't believe she's saying that." My daughter's fingers danced over her screen, capturing every frame. Mrs. Hargrove from across the street leaned over slightly and whispered to herself, "This is unbelievable." The room had become an arena with every glance a judgment, every phone a witness, and every word a weapon. I tried to remain composed, but the weight of decades of unnoticed effort pressed down like a boulder. My heart raced at exactly 3:56 p.m., and my breathing quickened. I caught sight of a small sticky note I had placed months ago on the fridge in the kitchen. "Remember, dignity always matters," and repeated it silently to myself. But even that mantra felt fragile in the face of her growing arrogance. She now stood slowly, leaning over the table with hands on the edge like a chess master ready to make her next move. "You never truly understood control, did you, Wilson? Your children may adore you, but everyone else sees the truth. Your obsession with detail is pathetic." The word pathetic reverberated in the air like a slap across the face. I felt my stomach churn, and the sensation of leather chairs against my thighs became secondary to the pressure of witnessing eyes. My son fidgeted his sneakers, scraping softly against the floor. My daughter whispered, "Do something," while recording every second. My neighbor, Mr. Feldman, walking his dog, paused outside the window, staring in disbelief, and my cousin Carla's mouth fell open. I realized in that moment that my patience, my humility, my efforts to remain composed had all been pushed to the brink. The first tiny humiliations were gone, replaced by a crescendo of public scrutiny and emotional assault. Each word she uttered was a calculated stab. The red lights on my blocked credit cards seemed to burn brighter, mocking the effort I had spent a lifetime building. The scene felt surreal. The smell of coffee, the faint vanilla, the creak of the ceiling fan, the distant hum of traffic all seemed amplified, as if the world itself were conspiring to highlight my shame. I clenched my jaw hard and slowly exhaled. The tension in the room seemed to vibrate as I felt something shift inside, a quiet anger simmering beneath decades of restraint. A small seed of resolve began to sprout amidst a storm of embarrassment. I realized that this confrontation was more than a critique of finances. It was an assault on my dignity, on my entire life's work. And in that moment, I understood clearly that tolerance had run out, patience had been exhausted, and the line had been crossed. The witnesses outside, inside, and even on video were now spectators to what I can only describe as the ultimate crescendo of humiliation. My mother-in-law's arrogance had peaked. Each smirk, each dismissive hand gesture a dagger, each statement a blow. And yet in that same instant of quiet but firm thought anchored in my chest the understanding that every single act of patience, every sacrifice, every unnoticed effort had not been wasted, because now the stage was set for the next chapter, for a moment when dignity, power, and justice will reclaim the narrative. Stay with me, because the next chapter will reveal the awakening. The moment I realized I would not be reduced to shame, and that the turn of events was about to begin, that the cards, the witnesses, and the arrogance would soon collide with something they never expected, exactly here on 47th Street in Chicago at 3:58 p.m. At exactly 1 p.m. after crescendo of ridicule, my chest tight with indignation, and eyes locked on the blinking red lights of my blocked credit cards, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind. This ends now? I looked around the room at my daughter, still recording, her fingers hovering over the screen, my son frozen halfway to the doorway, and my cousin Carla leaning forward, as if she could anticipate my next move. The faint hum of traffic outside and the soft creak of the ceiling fan became background to a sudden clarity. I had spent years exercising patience and humility, sacrificing vacations, sleep, and comfort for my family, and yet the dismissive smirk of my mother-in-law had pushed me to the brink. In that moment, I realized that decades of careful planning, meticulous record-keeping, and quiet generosity had created more than just financial stability. They had built a foundation of power that was subtle but unassailable, a power she did not recognize, a power rooted in integrity, foresight, and legal documentation. I adjusted my posture, slowly feeling my shoulders rise and my back straighten, as I inhaled a deep breath, smelling the faint coffee lingering in the room mixed with the vanilla candles I had lit to create warmth, now juxtaposed with the cold sting of injustice. I remembered exactly how at 7:15 p.m. on a crisp October evening in 2012, I had quietly set up a trust fund for my children totaling $47,500.37, and had retained full control of all accounts, including emergency funds and a separate FDIC-insured account with $12,863.92, sitting ready for any unforeseen circumstance. I realized that what she had assumed was vulnerability was actually latent power waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I could feel the tiny shift in energy in the room as I stopped reacting emotionally and began observing strategically. My mother-in-law noticed it first. Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered and said, with a sharper edge, "I see you're sulking now." But I didn't sulk. I simply crossed my arms and said softly yet firmly, "I'm not sulking, I'm planning." The word hung in the air with a weight they had never carried before. My daughter whispered, "Wow, he's different now." Her eyes wide, my son straightened instinctively, and my cousin Carla leaned closer to catch every detail. I looked down at the credit cards blinking in red like tiny alarms, and thought how ironic that they symbolized not failure, but opportunity. The irony that every tool she believed gave her power over me actually revealed my own control became apparent. I took another deep breath, counting in my head 4020140202402 3 seconds passing like a drumbeat of resolve, and felt the first spark of empowerment in my chest. I remembered the files neatly organized in my office, each one detailing every transaction, gift, and investment I had ever made with exact numbers, including the two 436.22 for my son's furniture, 312.56 for my mother-in-law's 50th birthday gift, and 429.30 for the washing machine replacement at my daughter's apartment. I realized that while she had the stage, the audience, and the momentary thrill of arrogance, I had the documentation, the authority, and the truth silently waiting to be revealed. I allowed a small smile to play across my lips, a subtle but visible shift that even she could notice. Planning, I repeated internally like a mantra, feeling the air itself thicken with anticipation and tension. I could sense the witnesses reacting, the atmosphere changing. Mrs. Hargrove adjusted her phone slightly on the porch, as if sensing that the climax she anticipated might be turning. Carla, leaning closer to whisper, "He's not beaten." And my daughter, lowering her phone slightly, but still recording the shift in energy. I observed my mother-in-law's subtle unease as she tapped her finger lightly on the mahogany table, and I felt the first hint of her doubt crack through her confident facade. I realized in that moment that this was not just about money, it was about dignity, about authority, and about reclaiming narrative control. The faint scent of her Chanel No. 5 mixed with the coffee and vanilla now symbolized not just intimidation, but a stage for revelation. A quiet power within me had awakened slowly, but irrevocably. I felt a shift in posture, in breathing, in heart rate, a controlled calm replacing the racing pulse of earlier humiliation, every second stretching like elastic. Reinforcing the change, the first subtle moves of my empowerment had begun. A small gesture of crossed arms, a calm voice, a deliberate pause in my gaze, and I could feel the ripple of impact among the witnesses' attention. The room now subtly rewired, as if electricity had replaced the oppressive atmosphere of ridicule. I realized that in this silence the seeds of the next act were taking root, that my patience had matured into strategy, and that the moment of awakening had arrived. Stay with me, because the next chapter will solidify this decision, will show the deliberate and strategic choice to act, and will set the stage for the revelation of power that my mother-in-law never imagined would come from the very person she tried to diminish here on 47th Street in Chicago at exactly 3 p.m. The calm before the storm had arrived, and the tide was about to turn forever. At exactly 5 p.m., I made a conscious choice, a deliberate strategic decision that no longer would I allow decades of patience, sacrifice, and careful planning to be dismissed or mocked. I sat back slightly in my chair, letting my shoulders relax, and felt a surge of clarity wash over me. Every detail of my life's work suddenly visible to me in a way it hadn't been before. The blocked credit cards, still blinking red like tiny alarms on a mahogany table, became symbols of leverage rather than failure. I could see my mother-in-law across the table, her smirk slightly twitching. As if sensing a subtle shift in energy, I allowed my gaze to wander over the room, taking note of the witnesses. My daughter, still holding her phone, recording every nuance. My son, standing slightly behind, her hands clenched but eyes attentive. And my cousin Carla, leaning forward, capturing every detail with a mixture of awe and concern. I realized now that strategy was as much psychological as it was financial. I remembered that trust fund I had set up for my children in 2012, totaling $47,500.37, and the separate FDIC insured account holding exactly $12,863.92 reserved for emergencies, each dollar carefully allocated, documented, and controlled entirely by me. I recalled the exact times and dates of every major expenditure, from the $2,436.22 from my son's furniture in Uptown to the $429.30 for my daughter's washing machine replacement in Lincoln Park, to the $312.56 for her mother's 50th birthday gift. And it hit me that every minor act of generosity was in fact a tool in my arsenal. Every receipt, spreadsheet, and bank record meticulously organized and ready if needed. I took a deliberate breath, feeling the faint scent of coffee and vanilla mingling with the faint Chanel No. 5 my mother-in-law wore as a kind of ironic perfume. It had always represented her authority, but now it was just another detail in the scene. I let my lips curve into a subtle, controlled smile, a signal of inner calm and strategic patience. I said softly, almost under my breath, "Planning isn't lost when patience ends." And I saw a flicker of recognition cross her eyes, as if she realized, even subconsciously, that I was no longer reacting emotionally. I began to visualize the steps I would take in precise or the accounts I would show, the witnesses whose presence would amplify the truth, the documentation I would reveal, all while maintaining dignity and composure. I remembered that silent night on Fullerton Avenue in Chicago in 1982 when I first balanced a checkbook with my father, the smell of rain on the asphalt, the squeak of the old bicycle tires, and the quiet advice he gave me, "Wilson, never let anyone diminish your worth. Your work is your shield and your legacy," echoed like a mantra through my mind. Now more powerful than ever, I let my eyes meet my mother-in-law's directly and simply said, "I've made a decision." The words carried weight like stones dropped into a still pond of silence in the room. Thick and my daughter lowered her phone slightly, sensing the tension. My son straightened, and my cousin Carla leaned forward slightly, the faint creak of the ceiling fan above and the tick of the wall clock at exactly 4. 6 p.m. seemed amplified like a metronome, marking the start of a new rhythm of control. I remembered every small humiliation over the years of comments about overspending, the whispered judgments at family dinners, the dismissive glances and the smirks. I stored them not as resentment, but as evidence now. They were part of the strategy. They were part of the narrative I would reveal when the time was right. I felt the subtle shift in the room as my mother-in-law's eyes narrowed slightly. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the edge of the table, as if to brace herself for something she couldn't yet anticipate. I allowed my voice to remain calm, steady, and controlled. "This is not about proving anything to you. It's about reclaiming perspective and dignity for everyone in this room." Each word deliberate, measured, precise, and I felt the tiny ripple of anticipation in the air of the witnesses, sensing that the narrative had shifted ever so slightly, but irreversibly my mind cataloged every step. First show the blocked credit cards, then reveal the trust fund and emergency accounts, then provide exact documentation of every dollar spent on family needs and sacrifices, all while keeping composure and allowing her arrogance to unravel naturally. I remembered the faint sound of the traffic outside 47th Street. Chicago at 4, 6 p.m. and the subtle hum of Mrs. Hargrove's phone from across the street adjusting slightly, as if sensing the storm brewing. I could see the power I had cultivated quietly over decades now ready to emerge, and I knew this would not be about revenge, but about justice, dignity, and clarity, every detail meticulously orchestrated, every witness strategically positioned, and I felt a surge of calm authority, unlike anything I had felt before. I thought to myself, it's time to act, but with control. The room seemed to pulse with expectation, the soft ticking of the wall clock marking the seconds leading up to the moment when patience became strategy, when humility became authority, and when the long-standing imbalance would finally shift. I could feel my mother-in-law's subtle anxiety growing as she tapped her fingers lightly on a mahogany table. I sensed that her arrogance was about to collide with a truth she had never anticipated, and the faint scent of vanilla and coffee in the air now seemed charged with electricity. The stage was set, the witnesses ready, the cards in place, the power latent and precise. I leaned back slightly in my chair and allowed a quiet smile to linger, knowing that the next chapter would finally reveal the first signs of the plot twist and the reversal that would shift the entire dynamic forever here on 47th Street, Chicago, at exactly 7 p.m. At exactly 9 p.m. I stood slowly, letting my gaze sweep the room deliberately, the red lights on my blocked credit cards still blinking like tiny warnings. But now I saw them differently. They were tools, symbols of a system she underestimated. I walked over to my briefcase, sitting neatly by the door's leather soft but firm, carrying years of carefully organized records from 2000 onwards, every receipt, every bank statement, every dollar spent on family needs meticulously cataloged from the dollar, 2,436.22, from my son's Uptown furniture, to the $429.30 from my daughter's washing machine replacement in Lincoln Park, and the $312.56 from my mother-in-law's 50th birthday gift. I opened the briefcase, slowly letting the paper spill slightly across the floor, just enough to catch the light under the ceiling fan. The faint smell of aged paper mixed with coffee and vanilla wafted through the room, and I could see my mother-in-law's smirk falter for the first time in decades. She blinked rapidly, a subtle tremor in her usually confident posture. "Wilson, what are you doing?" she said, her voice sharper, less controlled, her hands fidgeting slightly on the mahogany table. I kept my voice calm, steady, yet full of authority. "I'm showing full picture," I said. My words deliberate. The room seemed to pause, all eyes on me. My daughter's phone tilted slightly as she continued recording But I noticed her lips parted in astonishment, my son's hands unclenched, eyes wide and alert, and my cousin, Carla, leaning forward, whispering. I didn't know he had all this. The faint hum of traffic outside 47th Street, Chicago, seemed to fade, replaced by the charged atmosphere in the living room. The first page I lifted showed the trust fund I had quietly set up in 2012, totaling $47,500.37, every document notarized, every signature verified. I held it gently and let my gaze meet hers. The first flicker of panic crossing her eyes was almost imperceptible, but it was there. I don't understand, she whispered under her breath. The usual control she wielded at family dinners evaporating like mist. The second page revealed the FDIC insurer emergency account, exactly $12,863.92, accessible only to me, precisely documented. Each transaction accounted for down to the last cent. I could see her fingers tapping nervously on the table, a rhythm betraying her internal disorientation. These are your finances, she asked, voice barely steady. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of the revelation sink, and among the witnesses the soft click of my daughter's phone camera was now a drumbeat of inevitability. I moved deliberately to the chart I had prepared months ago, detailing every investment, every expense, every act of generosity since 2000, showing exactly how each dollar had been allocated and the impact it had on my children's education, housing, and well-being. The table before us transformed into a map of decades of effort, sacrifice, and foresight. My mother in Law's hand shook slightly as she reached for a paper, but I moved it back gently, asserting control without raising my voice. It's not just money, I said quietly, letting the words land. It's accountability, integrity, and preparation. Her eyes widened further as she finally seemed to grasp that the casual dismissal she relied upon for years now worked against her. Every witness in the room sensed that my daughter whispering into her phone. He's incredible, my son leaning forward, hands resting lightly on the table as if bracing for impact, and my cousin Carla nodding slightly, and all the hum of electricity in the room seemed palpable. The faint aroma of vanilla and coffee now felt charged with anticipation. I pulled out the final page of the ledger, showing every single expenditure, every lesson, every birthday gift, every apartment repair from Uptown to Lincoln Park, every detail numbered, verified, and neatly highlighted from 2000 to 2019. I said clearly, every dollar counted, for every sacrifice documented. My mother-in-law's lips parted, a faint gasp escaping her as the realization hit her fully. The arrogance that had driven her for decades now collided with the truth. She had ignored her smirk, entirely gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. I allowed a moment of silence, letting the witnesses absorb the scene. The first spark of empowerment visible to all now radiated from me. My daughter lowered her phone slightly to whisper, I can't believe this is happening, Mrs. Hargrove across the street adjusted her camera. Sensing the tension shifting like tectonic plates, my son's hands rested calmly on the edge of the table, eyes wide with recognition that a transformation had begun. I could feel the quiet power I had cultivated over decades radiating. The first subtle but undeniable sign that the dynamic had changed. I said softly, deliberately, what you saw as weakness was preparation, patience, and respect for dignity. Now you see the full picture. Her hands trembled slightly now, her voice catching in disbelief. I never imagined. The room hung on my words, every breath a drumbeat marking the subtle but irreversible change. The witnesses absorbed a moment, the weight of years of misjudgment pressing down on the antagonist, while my quiet authority now dominated every inch of the room. The faint hum of the ceiling fan, the soft click of cameras, and the subtle aroma of coffee and vanilla seemed to amplify the electric tension. The first seeds of the plot twist had been planted, the first hints of reversal visible to all present. The arrogance of decades now confronted by facts and meticulous planning. Stay with me, because in the next chapter the revelation will reach its full impact. The witnesses will react with shock, and all the antagonist's misjudgment will become undeniable, and the full scope of my power will be undeniable here on 47th Street, Chicago at exactly 4:12 p.m. At exactly 4:14 p.m., the room's energy shifted palpably. Every eye locked on me as I moved deliberately to the center of the dining room table to block credit cards, still blinking red, no longer symbols of embarrassment, but visual cues of latent control. I picked up the ledger once again, flipping through pages filled with meticulously documented transactions, every single expenditure from 2000 to 2019 accounted. for with exact numbers $2,436.22 from my son's Uptown Furniture, $429.30 for my daughter's washing machine replacement in Lincoln Park, $312.56 for my mother-in-law's 50th birthday gift, every line highlighted for clarity and organized chronologically, so that every act of generosity and sacrifice could be fully understood. I could see the first signs of panic of my mother-in-law, her smirk gone, replaced by a subtle tremor in her hands. "Wilson, I don't understand," she whispered, voice barely audible but shaking with realization. I held up a notarized document. The 2012 trust fund totaling $47,500.37, with each signature clearly verified, and said softly yet firmly, "This trust fund, the FDIC insured account $12,863.92. And these meticulously documented expenditures show not just intention but accountability." The witnesses reacted instantly, my daughter lowering her phone and all, whispering, "I can't believe it, he did all this, my son." Leaning forward, eyes wide and hands resting lightly on the table, as if bracing for impact, my cousin Carla nodding subtly, while whispering, "This is incredible." Mrs. Hargrove from across the street adjusted her camera slightly. Sensing the undeniable shift in dynamics, the soft hum of traffic outside 47th Street, Chicago, and the faint tick of the wall clock faded into insignificance as all attention focused on a room, the full scope of my power, patience, and meticulous planning now undeniable. I could see the complete collapse of arrogance in my mother-in-law's posture, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support, her face pale and lips parted as the reality sank in. I never imagined," she stammered, voice breaking slightly. I let a calm smile play across my lips and said deliberately, "What you assumed was vulnerability was actually preparation. What you mistook for indecision was patience. What you thought was weakness was carefully cultivated strength." Each word landing with precision, every witness absorbing the full impact, my daughter's hands still slightly shaking as she held her phone, recording every second, my son's eyes reflecting a mix of awe and newfound respect, and my cousin Carla whispering, "I knew he had power, but not like this." The ledger pages now spread across the table like a visual map of my life's work, every number, every date, every transaction, a testament to decades of careful planning and unassailable authority. The faint aroma of coffee and vanilla in the room now felt charged, almost electric, emphasizing the dramatic shift. The soft click of cameras from witnesses across the street amplified the gravity of the moment. I stepped closer to my mother-in-law, voice calm but filled with authority. "All these years you dismissed every effort, every sacrifice, every thoughtful investment as trivial or foolish. Now the truth is undeniable." She swallowed hard, a faint tremor in her voice. I see it now." And I knew she finally understood the full scope of her misjudgment. Every witness in the room sensed complete reversal. The quiet energy of patience transformed into authoritative presence. The soft hum of the ceiling fan above seemed to underscore the tension. Every small detail, the blocked cards, the ledger, the notarized documents, the meticulous calculations now revealed a magnitude of power she had never anticipated. The room was silent, except for the subtle whisper of awe from my daughter. "It's unbelievable," my son nodding slowly in agreement, and my cousin Carla's eyes wide with respect. The red lights on the cards now felt symbolic, like beacons of control rather than humiliation. I allowed the moment to linger as the first real wave of recognition from my mother-in-law washed over the room. She leaned back slightly, tension visible in her shoulders, her previous arrogance completely undone. I underestimated you," she admitted quietly. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the witnesses across the street adjusting cameras, whispering to each other, fully absorbing the transformation, every subtle smell, sound, and visual cue now reinforcing the new dynamic. I reached for the final document, a complete compilation of investments, tuition payments, apartment repairs, and birthdays totaling $93,278.92 with exact dates, receipts, and notarizations clearly visible. I placed it gently on the table and said softly, "Now you see that every action, every sacrifice, every detail was done with intention and integrity." The witnesses now leaned in collectively, eyes wide, capturing the gravity of the moment, the faint aroma of vanilla and coffee mingling with subtle Chanel No. 5, now symbolizing authority and dignity rather than intimidation. I could see the complete shift in perception. My daughters whispered on my son's recognition and Carla's quiet admiration, the soft hum of the ceiling, Fan and distant traffic fading as the room's energy crystallized into a sense of justice, realized the power I had cultivated for decades, now undeniable by all and fully recognized by the antagonist. The scene was no longer about humiliation, but revelation, authority, and undeniable dignity. The plot twist, complete the reversal, total the lesson, unambiguous, and the transformation perception across every witness complete here on 47th Street, Chicago, at exactly 4:16 p.m. At exactly 4:18 p.m., the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The tension that had once pressed down like a heavy fog was replaced by a sense of inevitability. Every witness now visibly aware of the reversal. I could see my mother-in-law's hands trembling slightly, her previous dominance completely evaporated. I took a deliberate step toward the mahogany table and began distributing copies of the ledger and notarized documents to everyone present. My daughter received one, her fingers tracing the highlighted numbers and dates, with all. My son received another and held it carefully. Eyes wide, my cousin Carla leaned forward, whispering, "This is exactly what needed to happen." I looked directly at my mother-in-law and said firmly, "You will acknowledge these facts and respect the transparency of every action I've taken over the years." Her lips parted, her voice barely audible. I understand." The first real acknowledgement, accountability, and as I spoke, the witnesses outside across 47th Street began murmuring their support. Mrs. Hargrove adjusted her phone to fully capture the moment, saying quietly, "Finally, he's showing everyone the truth." Neighbors passing by peeked through the windows, sensing the shift in dynamics, the faint hum of traffic outside fading as collective attention focused entirely on the room. I began systematically walking through each documented expenditure, from the $2,436.22 for Uptown Furniture, the $429.30 washing machine in Lincoln Park, the $312.56 birthday gift, and beyond, each figure matched with receipts, bank statements, and notarizations. I observed a subtle panic growing in my mother-in-law's eyes as she realized there was no escape from the evidence, and the witnesses in the room were now fully aligned with the reality she had tried to obscure. I could see my daughter whispering into her phone, "Everyone needs to see this," her words carrying a mix of excitement and relief. My son leaning forward, nodding subtly, and my cousin Carla capturing every detail, silently documenting the accountability. The faint aroma of coffee and vanilla mixed with the crisp autumn air entering from the open window seemed to underscore the gravity of justice being restored. I continued, calmly yet with authority, detailing every act of careful planning, patience, and generosity, ensuring that the witnesses understood the full scope of my actions. And the depth of my mother-in-law's misjudgment. The red lights on the blocked credit cards now seemed almost symbolic of the past restrictions, each one now a clear marker how the narrative had shifted from humiliation to empowerment. I could see the subtle gestures of support ripple through the room, neighbors whispering, adjusting phones. Even a passerby pausing to observe the scene unfolding on 47th Street. The first tangible consequences of her arrogance were beginning to manifest. Her previous smirk entirely gone, replaced by a muted recognition of error. I outlined the impact of the documented funds, demonstrating exactly how each act benefited the children, maintained stability, and ensured accountability. The witnesses visibly absorbed every number, every date, every receipt, every detail was a testament to diligence and integrity, and her arrogance now crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. I paused deliberately, letting the silence emphasize the significance of the moment. The soft ticking of the wall clock, faint hum of the ceiling fan, and distant murmur of traffic outside, all fading into a focused attention on the room. The first phase of public accountability now complete, the subtle but firm acknowledgement of wrongdoing from my mother-in-law, providing the initial punctuation of justice. In real time, I distributed the final set of documents, including complete ledger totaling $93,278.92, every detail meticulously recorded and notarized to the witnesses present, and noted that anyone wishing to verify could do so immediately. Each document a visual representation of transparency and authority. I could sense the subtle shift in energy among witnesses outside. Inside, across the street, they whispered among themselves, nodding in approval. The air now heavy with a sense of justice being restored. The faint aroma of coffee and vanilla now carried an air of triumph. The red, blinking cards, the ledger, and the notarized documents, all tangible symbols of The reversal underway, my mother-in-law now slumped slightly in her chair, the first visible sign of her awareness of accountability, and the room collectively exhaling at the demonstration of clear, documented, and undeniable justice, the witnesses nodding, whispering, recording, and acknowledging the restored balance, the subtle smile I allowed to linger on my lips, signaling both calm authority and the satisfaction of seeing integrity recognized in real time here on 47th Street, Chicago at exactly 4:21 p.m. At exactly 4:23 p.m., the transformation in the room was undeniable. The tension of earlier humiliation, replaced by the electric clarity of justice, fully realized. Every witness now fully aligned with the new reality. I methodically laid out each document from the ledger, totaling $93,278.92, every bank statement, notarized every expenditure verified from $2,436.22 for Uptown Furniture to $429.30 for Lincoln Park Washing Machine and $312.56 for the 50th birthday gift my mother-in-law now visibly slumped her shoulders, tense her hands, resting limply on the mahogany table as the realization sank and she had misjudged not only me, but the entire scope of my decades-long preparation and strategic planning. I never anticipated, she whispered, voice breaking mid-sentence. Her usual arrogance completely dissolved. The witnesses absorbed every detail, my daughter recording the final moments with wide eyes, whispering, "He's unstoppable." My son leaning forward, silently taking in every nuance, and my cousin Carla shaking her head in disbelief. The distant neighbors outside 47th Street paused to watch, whispers of astonishment spreading as the first ripple of community acknowledgement took hold to faint. Hum of traffic fading under the collective focus of those present, I began to outline the consequences of her previous dismissals and the accountability measures now fully established, highlighting exact figures and timelines. $47,500.37 trust fund established in 2012, $12,863.92 FDIC insured emergency account carefully segregated and monitored, and every transaction from 2000 to 2019 documented meticulously for public and family record, each step punctuated with calm authority, letting the weight of accountability land with precision. The aroma of coffee and vanilla in the room now seemed imbued with gravity, reinforcing the clarity of truth and the inevitability of justice. I could see subtle tremors of panic in my mother-in-law's fingers, her subtle fumbling of the papers as she attempted to regain composure, a futile effort, as the witnesses now fully recognized the shift, the first wave of public and familial acknowledgement palpable across the room. My daughter nodding quietly to the camera, my son exhaling slowly in recognition of the restored balance, and Carlo whispering, "This changes everything," the soft ticking of the wall clock punctuating each moment of irreversible accountability, the red blinking credit cards now standing as symbolic markers of system she relied upon to assert temporary dominance, but now entirely ineffective. The ledger, notarized statements, and visible attention of witnesses collectively reversing every slight, every dismissal, every condescending remark. From previous years, I stepped back slightly and allowed my gaze to sweep the room, observing the tangible shift in perception. My mother-in-law's face pale, lips pressed together, eyes wide in awe at the undeniable power and strategy that had been hidden beneath decades of patience and composure, the witnesses nodding subtly, whispers of approval from those outside filtering to the open window, the faint hum of the ceiling fan above, the distant traffic, the aroma of coffee and vanilla, all serving as subtle witnesses to the complete reversal. The first real wave of social accountability now fully manifested, the subtle but unmistakable shift from humiliation to empowerment, now extending beyond the immediate family to neighbors and passers-by, the soft click of cameras from outside capturing the event, adding an extra layer of permanence to the moment. I outlined each financial and personal action to reinforce transparency, from $2,436.22 to $429.30 to $312.56, every figure documented, every choice explained in a calm, authoritative voice, each revelation increasing the weight of recognition in the room, the ripple of acknowledgement growing palpable. My mother-in-law now fully seated back in her chair, shoulders slumped, smirk gone, realizing the magnitude of misjudgment. As I calmly said, "The truth has always existed in these records. What you assumed to be weakness was in fact planning, patience, and dignity, now fully revealed." each word landing with precision, reinforcing both the ethical and strategic authority I cultivated over decades, the witnesses reacting with subtle, all my daughter whispering, "This is historic." My son exhaling, slowly nodding, and Carla quietly saying, "I can't believe how controlled he is." The red credit cards, ledger, notarized documents, receipts, and exact calculations now all visible and tangible proof of my complete empowerment. The final wave of recognition settling in the room, the aura of control, authority, and dignity fully established. The antagonistic force now visibly humbled, acknowledging the undeniable shift, and the witnesses outside reinforcing the transformation, collectively the soft aroma of coffee, vanilla, and faint Chanel No. 5 now symbolizing not intimidation, but legitimate power, the hum of the ceiling fan, and distant traffic, reduced to mere background, as the room celebrated the effect of reversal and public demonstration of justice here on 47th Street, Chicago, at exactly 4:26 p.m. At exactly 4:28 p.m., I sank back into my chair, allowing a long, deep breath to fill my lungs. The room now fully settled, the energy shifted from tension to reflection. Every witness now absorbing not just the facts, but the journey. The blocked credit cards, no longer symbols of humiliation, but markers of the path I had taken from vulnerability to empowerment. I looked around the room at my daughter, lowering her phone with a soft smile, my son's calm nod of respect, and my cousin Carla, quietly absorbing the weight of decades-long strategy and patience. Even my mother-in-law, seated across the table, shoulders slumped, lips pressed together, eyes wide to soften the ceiling fan above the distant traffic outside 47th Street, Chicago, and the faint aroma of coffee and vanilla now carried a sense of closure, dignity, and calm authority. I reflected on the journey that brought me here, the countless nights spent balancing budgets, meticulously recording every transaction, the years of sacrificed sleep, missed vacations, personal comforts deferred, all invested in my family and in integrity, and the quiet cultivation of latent power, now fully revealed. The flashbacks came like a gentle wave the October night in 2012, when I set up the $47,500.37 trust fund, the exact $12,863.92 reserved for emergencies. Every receipt from $2,436.22 to $429.30 to $312.56, each detail now a testament to patience, discipline, and foresight. I realize that true empowerment is not loud or immediate. It is cultivated with intention and revealed strategically when the moment is right. The witnesses in the room seemed to feel this as well. My daughter whispered softly, "I never imagined you were capable of this." My son nodded slowly. He always planned quietly. And my cousin Carla murmured, "Patience and dignity really do pay off." The full art of humiliation, awareness, awakening, revelation, justice, and impact now complete. I spoke softly yet with calm authority. This experience isn't just about me or the situation. Here it's a lesson about patience, integrity, and standing firm even when underestimated. My mother-in-law, now finally quiet, seemed to absorb the statement, her previous arrogance replaced with contemplative humility. The blocked credit cards, now a silent reminder that perceived limitations can conceal strength. A ledger and notarized documents, tangible proof that preparation and strategic thinking overcome temporary humiliation. I turned to the audience, as if speaking directly to anyone who has ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or powerless, and said, "You may have faced situations where your efforts were ignored, your contributions dismissed, or your dignity questioned, but remember that true strength is cultivated in silence and revealed with intention." The witnesses outside murmured agreement, some filming, some nodding, and some whispering words of acknowledgement. The subtle scent of coffee and vanilla, carrying a sense of calm, reflection, the soft ticking of the wall clock, a reminder that time itself bears witness to patience and perseverance. I allowed the story to settle, then leaned forward slightly and added, "If you ever felt underestimated or dismissed, share your experience below. Let's build a community of respect, recognition, and empowerment." A subtle smile crossing my lips. And for those wanting more stories and strategies about overcoming humiliation and reclaiming your narrative, don't forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell to stay updated. My daughter, now placing her phone down, nodded with a small grin. "Everyone should hear this," I said softly. "This is about dignity, strategy, and the transformation that comes when patience meets action." I glanced at my mother-in-law one final time, the room still charged, yet calm, the lesson clear, the impact permanent, the empowerment, undeniable, the aroma of vanilla coffee, and faint Chanel No. 5, now intertwined with triumph, dignity, and reflection, the soft on the ceiling fan, and distant traffic. Fading into insignificance as the story reached its close, I looked directly into the camera, as if speaking to each viewer personally. Remember, you're worth your preparation, and your dignity cannot be dismissed even by those who think they hold power. And with that, the scene concluded. The witnesses inspired, the antagonist humbled, the lesson learned, and the narrative arc complete on 47th Street, Chicago. At exactly 4:30 p.m., the journey from humiliation to empowerment fully realized, the story told, the justice delivered, and the transformation permanent, leaving viewers with a sense of awe, reflection, and actionable inspiration.